Okay, thank you. Next up is Daniela Rosner from the University of Washington. And she and her colleagues wrote an interesting paper on the collision between code and clay. The floor is yours.
Can I use this?
You could use this.
Okay. Thank you. So, hello? Yes. So, handheld down. That's okay. Okay, so as long as you can hear me, great. So yes, I'm presenting this work on behalf of my two colleagues and myself, Miwa Ikemiya, who is Miwa's a former student at CCA and now works at Townsend, and Tim Regan at MSR Cambridge in the UK. And this work actually began, in a sense, at the California College of the Arts, so locally here, sort of got picked up in a project at MSR, and then is continuing at the University of Washington. And the part I'm focusing on is so the work that was done with some ceramicists in Cambridge, UK. So hopefully this picks up on threads of the last talk in the sense of where the machine's imperfections can start to allow us to investigate certain questions about the malleability and resistances of mediums, including the digital mediums that we interact with here. So what I wanted to start with is this photograph that's familiar to many of us, this idea of what a CAD model looks like, a model that has an embodied form. Of course, we see it on a computer screen, we interact with it through this CAD software, and yet it's still an open question how this sort of actions that we bring to bear on the material that this will result in have any bearing on sort of the processes that we use to sculpt this material. So this is a sort of a long-standing question from the arts and crafts movement forward around in what ways the kinds of mechanics and sort of mechanical tools that we've developed over the years have become to displace, to reimagine, to extend the human capacities for form building, particularly human labor and skill and the value it has. So I'm picking up on this in the domain of ceramics to talk about what we're calling the sound bowl, which is the sort of result of a lot of these kind of explorations with material. And what the sound bowl is a vessel that was designed to record audio messages through surface undulations on the surface of this that you can see here. That's a lot like a vinyl record. So scratching the surface reveals the sound to varying degrees, which I'll talk about soon. So our thinking sort of emerged across a series of conversations and experiments and reflections that actually began through in the Cambridge, UK section around the V&A's show of Edmund Duval's ceramic works. So his installations are often site-specific. This is this massive circular metal shelf that kind of fits at the inside of the dome ceiling, and it's really striking for a couple reasons. I mean, it's so immense, right, in size, but it's also quite delicate and intimate in the sense of the forms that it depicts. And what's compelling about this is it starts to entangle sort of the meanings that we attribute to ceramics and the kinds of ways in which we're producing them and showing them and using them today, and that this craft sensibility is actually taken up to think about our development of tools and materials more broadly. So he actually says, Edmund Duval writes about the medium of ceramics in a way that kind of evokes the digital for me and my colleagues. So here he talks about Joseph Albers is a celebrated artist who taught at the Black Mountain College as refusing to sanction the teaching of ceramics art at that college. And why this is now, according to Duval, why Albers believed clay to be sort of resistant or ill fit to this teaching is because it was itself too resistant a material to handle, which is somewhat perplexed, right? Where it's a peculiar way of framing a material that seemingly has this sort of malleability and it could be roughened, hardened, and softened, but as something that is in fact quite rigid. So how might this be? So here we're drawing from a series of thinkers who are trying to understand the mediums of making and how they start to characterize and shape our actions with material. And in particular, Tim Ingold, anthropologist, describes making as sort of thinking in terms of not just simple mechanical execution of complex structures, but of the generation potentials of complex processes. So again, highlighting the process, he's relating sort of storytelling and wayfaring to this process of making, where we're producing itineraries without fixed templates or pre-composed plots. And this is contrasting to these point-by-point connections that digital tools like CAD might embody. So this is sort of counter to some work that we might be familiar with in the digital space around sort of Malcolm McCullough's thinking around extending the hand in the digital realm, or Sennett's sort of suggestion similarly that there is possibilities for any human activity to evoke these sort of improvisational forms. And this is more in line with people like David Pye, a woodworker, starts to think about what happens when we codify human workmanship. And Ingold points to an artist here, a Brazilian artist, who's named Lara Vinci, whose work she describes as this anti-machine, where a conveyor belt kind of continually transports this fine-grained marble from one heap to another. And the piece is kind of demonstrating this activity of making the mound that's both about the mound itself as a form and is about the environmental impact of mining in the state of Minas Gerais. So this is sort of a both entangling of the symbolic, the semiotic, and the material in this sense. And this is something that feminist science studies scholar Karen Barad brings up and aligns very much with Ingold's work. So the point is that in their entanglement, these individual agencies are preceding their practices, and they lack this independent, self-contained status. So we really have to look how material, the meaning that material holds, is sort of always developing out of our engagements with the world. So returning to Devel's installation here, we're asking now, what does it mean for this medium to resist or align with another? And how might this alignment change, especially with respect to what is commonly considered the most malleable material of all, like software? So to look at these questions, we first consider these recent developments in code and clay that we're familiar with here in TEI, so traditional craft materials finding their place in these digital worlds like sand and clay and the hybrid forms that are produced, and the opportunities they provide for exploring this connection from analog and analytic feedback. And some recent art pieces start to speak to this clearly as well. So the Whispering Table here is a place where museum goers can listen to audio recorded stories about food and tradition coming inside the bowls themselves. And the Particular Studio similarly starts to play with the mode of ceramics as porcelain speakers that resemble bowls. So kind of blurring the boundary between craftsmanship and technology through what they call this poetry to everyday life. And Jonathan Keep here, maybe most connected to this digital integration, is looking at adapting a 3D printer to extrude this carefully formulated slip that's constructing digital formed ceramic objects. And Jeffrey Mann's work, you might be familiar with, is exploring what happens when the bowls witness the sound of arguments. How can we materialize that through form? So using, again, this digital to start expanding and exploring those modes of interaction. So here is the first part of our investigation where we start to ask these questions of ceramicists in the area. So we worked with designers and ceramicists who are using this material, essential modes or topics in their work, and then to ask them a series of questions, but around their studio visits and homes where they ended up working with these materials. So the first theme that I wanted to highlight is this notion of endurance that was actually articulated in very different ways across the ceramics objects that we observed. So here is Evelyn's plate that she had made herself, but that she chose not to sell because it was chipped. And these turned out to be the only objects that she keeps, right? The ones with the chips, the ones with imperfection. And as a result, these objects sort of cycle through her home, and she sees those as being the ones most sort of practiced and used on a daily basis and beyond. So this now idea of the imperfection as being a virtue, not only in the sense of its sort of uniqueness, but in terms of the lasting qualities that it provides in the everyday sense. A second piece is this translation of longevity into this idea of understanding what the object is about, both from the exterior and from the inside. So these are objects that Helen, a potter I'll describe soon, is using to think about relationships between mothers and daughters. And here you can see that the images on these pots, they're actually produced through Xerox copies that she then overlays on the forms, but she calls them not very precise, that the extra spots and things happen, but it gives it a sort of freedom to be not too photographic, right? So it's sort of breaking with the medium of photography that has more precision to its form. And in this, she's trying to highlight not just the imprecision and the kind of quality of the social in the imagery, but also in the form of those vases themselves, that the vessels start to sort of gesture in ways that reflect who they are in their interactions between. So in taking some of these qualities around sort of control and the embracing of the imperfection, we began to explore in a series of pieces what it would mean to integrate the digital and clay. This, as I said, built on work that we started at the California College of Art, and that work is the thinking of breakage, or what was the Japanese technique of kintsugi, which is this notion of highlighting the cracks, in this case through paint, but traditionally gold. And the idea of taking what was once this generic piece of pottery, breaking it to make that more unique to the maker, as well as potentially expanding it to think about it being unique to, right, the digital. And this is really based on sort of a crude kind of notion of what cracks tend to evoke. So we began to explore through various other modes what happens when these experiments start to break on other levels as well. So using a material called bare conductive, black conductive poster paint, we built this potentiometer to read different levels of resistance. And while experimenting with this, we associated these specific ranges of resistance with personal photos. And touching a point along this crack yielded a specific photo. Again, sort of reproducing some of these initial modes of connection. But then as we went along, we noticed these different interactions emerge. So the conductive finger glove was completely unnecessary in that interaction, and following this, used this aluminum plate and started to break the pieces themselves and put them back together. And this is where at the small sort of intimate level, the technology became more interesting. So with the fact that the cracks we were paired with paint would actually break themselves, so they would be working one day, and then after drying, broken another, produce this sort of tension between what was actually part of breakdown. Was it the code itself or the material that was gluing it together? So in these sensing experiments, it kind of warned us that these both connections and compatibilities. So on the one hand, the visibility itself of breakdown, that the cracks in the clay were really happening in two mediums. It left us searching for hidden bugs in the digital. And then the paint left us wishing that we could sort of understand the process of drawing and master that in a new way. So that on the other hand, these cracks actually had a dual purpose where they became materials for concern and sort of our articulation of difference. So our process of defining and building the sound bowl developed these concerns across different stages. And we ended up developing that further in the sound bowl, which is these stages of framing, modeling, and amplifying. So this now began with a new collaboration with one of the women we worked with, Helen Martino, who provided the initial material and process for our project. So Helen worked with clay, slabs of clay that she stamped with. She stamped to create certain textures, and she had painted them after. So you can see some of the texture on the left. She painted them after a staged firing process. So during our initial discussions with her, we were interacting with what's called a talkie tape, a kind of ribbon that is a child's game. You can kind of run your fingernail across and hear phrases like "Happy Birthday" and "Happy New Year." And similar to the work of potters we had been inspired by, there's a kind of emphasis on the texture on the outside of glazing processes that produce texture that we were hoping to connect between these two projects. So we moved on to actually modeling the talkie tape alongside working with Helen, and first rubbed ink into the ridges of the tape so that it was only visible in the grooves, and scanned the tape and traced those lines and our vector graphic software. And as you can see here, the different colors map to actually different depths. So over time, we printed this out then on a laser cutter and noticed the fidelity of the marks start to change already, sort of that the sound that was produced was barely audible as the stage, and returned back to this file and continued to play. So mapping it around the outer rim of a circular object, we then printed, well, first reducing it in pattern and simplicity, and then finally making the marks simple enough to print out in the 3D printer. Ooh. So modeling and printing in this way allowed us to kind of, again, formulate what would happen to make this into a bowl, both by hand and by machine, and found that the crude marks produced a pretty rudimentary sound. So finally, this clay bowl was produced, and we brought it back to the studio to begin amplifying the handmade process. So the last stage, we brought this back to Helen's lab, produced the Slab Technique with the lines that we used alongside the printed bowl and the vector graphics file that guided those actions. And then firing, which is in another sense, every 3 months was Helen's process for firing, quite a different process than many of our prototypes follow. And given this cycle, we expected to only really have one chance to produce the object, so this influenced the kind of risk and process we took on. And finally, this initial BIS firing enabled us to then do an underglaze that, again, shaped those marks and continue to work on the rougher areas, which were not smooth like other parts of the bowl, to produce would be finally a China mark, so an auditory China mark that would sort of symbolize the artist's collaboration. So this is the final piece that came out from that process and allowed us to now quickly look back at these questions of alignment that the bowls produce. So our work brought to fore many ways of learning and understanding the digital and clay through gesture, and we felt these different ways of knowing were being captured and prompted us to become a little bit more purposeful about where we put our hands. And in this sense, we trace the ephemeral in code and clay, but that was itself kind of changing the behavior that we hoped to trace. So there's this tension between the sort of intentions of the maker and the outcome. And the second concern, just to end, is this concern for digital craft and how it could be more effectively leveraged, both as sort of itself a set of activities that require deep sensitivities to material and to the kinds of structures and communities that they end up being taken up in. So this sort of points to, in a way, this idea of digital grips being something that we might not just consider at the sort of material level, but also at these larger levels of which kinds of communities of practice are taking up these tools and how. And this is actually where our work is heading today, is in sort of building out this sound bowl into a studio space that is local in Seattle that we hope to collaborate across mechanical engineering and the studio to produce additional ideas of where these techniques are heading. So with that, I will take questions and yeah, end the talk. Thank you.
Hi, Rolf Vertigo, Queen's University. Fantastic work. I really love this. I think this is tangible. Okay, this is totally tangible. This is more how we should think than sort of thinking about technologies and what we can build with them. Let's go the other way. Now, you're using a lot of analog methods, but you said there was sound in there.
Right.
Do you have any audio clips or anything that would let us hear what that does?
I had actually wanted to do this as a demo originally.
But do you have anything on your computer? Because I'm so curious.
I can point you to the link after this talk.
Sure.
Yeah.
But fantastic work. Really love it.
Well, I would also like to say that it's very interesting, and I really liked your approach and the fact that you have worked with makers, with artists and ceramists. And my question is actually related to their feeling about the objects they made. So did you have the sense that they felt this ownership over the process of making these objects when you had these 3D printed phases or this like involvement of digital tools?
So ownership in the sense that they felt like they were a part of the process, or is that they actually were integral to the form being made.
They feel that these are like their own creations.
Yeah. So for the sound bowl, that was much more present than for the 3D printed bowl, which was really running counter to the process that we went through with the handmade sound bowl. And what was interesting is that sort of got woven into the making of the last bowl that I showed. So in that sense, that part of the process was really separate from the collaboration, but it was hard to sort of disentangle, right, what we brought to bear to that collaboration from the different parts. So I think to answer your question, yes and no, right? It's hard to say that process wouldn't have happened without the 3D print.
Cool. Thank you.
Okay. If there are no more questions, let's thank Daniela again for a nice talk.